We've all heard of the American dream, the belief that no matter who you are, all you have to do to be successful is work hard and you'll succeed.
Easier said than done for Black Americans. Think about this. It's 2020. Jim Crow laws were only abolished 56 years ago. Our parents were in segregated schools, riding on the back of the bus, forced to use colored entrances. Lynching was widespread. Black people were stopped from voting. It meant no one representing or advocating for them and their communities in local, state, or national government.
The impact of Jim Crow is still being felt today. For many Black families, it's like riding a bike with only one pedal.
A great many of our colleagues use the phrase systemic racism to suggest that the entire criminal justice system is imbued with racism. I don't believe that's accurate.
From Congress to a University of Central Florida professor's now deleted tweets saying, quote, Black privilege is real, there's a consistent questioning of whether systemic racism exists.
No justice! No peace!
And this mentality that says, why can't all those Black people chanting in the streets for reform just get a job, save their money, be respectful to police, and do better?
And so a lot of people, if they imagine a bird in a bird cage, if you're only thinking about one bar, right? So maybe just criminal justice system. You kind of look and you say, well, why can't the bird get out of that, right? There's only one bar in front of them. They should be able to go to the left or right and get around it. But if you were to step back and look at the complete picture and see the complete cage, you'd see that there are all these interlocking, connected bars, right? So criminal justice, education, housing, all these different things. It doesn't mean that Blacks or people of color, it's impossible for them to get out of situations that they're in, but it's much more difficult because of the interlocking nature of the system.
As Professor Jonathan Cox sat with me in the hot Florida sun, it became clear this story would only be a snapshot of America's systems of oppression. Of course, there's the nearly 250 years Black people were shipped, whipped, bought, sold, and forced into the backbreaking work of building the country's economic power for free. But beyond that, there's a recurring issue when it comes to wealth and opportunity in America.
Nice house, isn't it?
Racist housing policies, and there are many.
They were able to help him get a loan by guaranteeing it up to $2,000.
Professor Cox likes to start with the GI Bill.
That was billions of dollars that was pumped into the U.S. economy, and that's where we started to see the development of the white middle class.
So starting in 1944, the U.S. government offered veterans coming back from World War II money to start businesses or get a college education and low or no interest home loans. But it was still the time of legalized segregation, and with no federal oversight.
Over 1 million Black veterans were denied these benefits, right? Which is a significant number of people, right? And so again, this money was dispersed over like 30 years worth of time. So just imagine the compounding effects of 30 years where Blacks are not allowed to participate or allowed to participate at much lower rates than whites, right? They just they can't keep up, right? We're starting at a much different place now, years later, where whites who were able to access this money were then able to turn this around, give money to their children, help pay for their children's education.
African Americans who were prohibited. Not they didn't want to, not because they didn't like living among whites. They were prohibited from moving into these suburbs, and they could easily afford to do so.
Richard Rothstein writes in his New York Times bestseller, The Color of Law,
and there is a large variety of home sites available.
These same loans were being given to white middle and lower class families, not just vets, with a requirement not to sell to Black people. Then there's redlining, the government's refusal to insure loans in or near African American neighborhoods, like the areas highlighted in pink in this decades-old map of Philadelphia.
Homeownership rate of Black families in the Orlando metropolitan area is only 44%. Contrast that to white families where it's above the majority, it's at 70.
What Zillow's Skylar Olson just shared are current percentages, by the way, especially damaging since for so many Americans, wealth is tied up in a home. What else does where you live impact? Education.
So you know there's that wall between Maitland and Eatonville, like if you drive through. That wall was only built in the early 1960s.
Professor Robert Castanello told me walls of all kinds denied black people access in Florida. He says even though black people successfully lobbied to create the state's public education system, up until the 1920s, they were only taught through the 10th grade in underfunded schools. Decades later, Castanello says Florida started pumping money into black schools, like the current Jones High. It had the exact same blueprint as Edgewater High, the white school, unheard of at the time.
The attempt was to argue before the Supreme Court that Florida schools, both black and white, were funded equally or almost equally, and they thought that would defend the state of Florida against any desegregation case.
The plan failed with the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education ruling that separate but equal schools were unconstitutional. Schools slowly integrated, but today, 66 years later, less than 1% of Jones's student population is white.
This is because of, desegregation practices that exacerbated racial segregation rather than alleviated, as well as white flight.
Only a couple of hours drive over modern, streamlined highways to any metropolitan Florida city.
Now, remember what I said about walls? Well, in the 50s, America started building highways, which not only kept blacks and whites separate, but also decimated black neighborhoods, I-4 included.
City leaders were never interested in the opinion of residents of Paramore about where I-4 should go, what homes and businesses would be disrupted by I-4, but they really were concerned when the residents of Winter Park were upset about I-4 going too close to the downtown of Winter Park.
Professor Castanello says that's why the highway skirts the very edges of Winter Park but goes straight through downtown. He says black people being left out of major public decisions started to change after the Civil Rights Movement and after the Voting Rights Act of 1965 passed. Technically, black men had the right to vote since 1870, but there were challenges.
We saw poll taxes, right? So, requiring a certain amount of money to be able to vote. We saw laws about grandfather clauses. We saw the implementation of literacy tests and other forms of testing to see if blacks were able to vote.
Castanello told me in Florida, voting directions were printed in newspapers, so clearly you'd have to know how to read.
We finally restored the rights to 1.4 million Floridians.
Now, nearly 2 years after Florida voters overwhelmingly passed it, Amendment 4 is caught in a legal fight over ex-felons having to pay fines and fees before being granted their voting rights. Some call that a modern-day poll tax. Then there's violence. This November will mark 100 years since the Ocoee Massacre,
which again involved law enforcement and involved white military veterans driving in from Orlando to lay siege to a community of African Americans who had simply tried to vote and were massacred doing so. Where's the grand jury hearings, proceedings? Where's the victim testimony, Jasmine? Let's ask ourselves that.
Professor Paul Ortiz says July Perry's lynching during that massacre is part of the state's often untold history. Florida had the highest number of lynchings per capita in the country from 1880 to 1940. Ortiz says policing is steeped with the mentality of those mobs who murdered black people, initially as slave patrols.
Any white person, no matter what training they have, no matter how rich or poor they are, has the right to chase after, beat, humiliate, abduct African Americans in the South.
Ortiz also pointed me to a 2016 Sarasota Herald Tribune report on sentencing in Florida, which found, among many disparities, judges in Flagler County put blacks convicted of armed robbery away for nearly triple the time of whites. Nearly 2,500 days for blacks, 957 for whites.
Talking about thousands of cases. There's unequal sentencing that's targeting African Americans in Florida for much harsher, much longer much more punitive punishments. And that's going on today.
I've gone to depositions in the past, and I walk into the room, and everybody assumes I'm not the lawyer. I'm everybody but the lawyer. Are you the court reporter? No, I'm not. And then they go down, okay, are you the witness? No, I'm not. And then finally, after a couple minutes, oh, you're the lawyer. Yes, I could be a lawyer too.
LaShonda K. Jackson has personally seen bias in the courtroom. She's also the Orange County Bar Association's first black president in the organization's 87 years, and a great example of something Professor Cox pointed out. Black people are underrepresented in executive level leadership, top levels of government, and even if you're able to say, get hired at a reputable law firm and serve your community, you'll still experience racism.
Even if you have a college degree.
Absolutely right. We see that it doesn't really matter. We still see the discrimination, again, happening at all levels of society, right? Which is one of the strongest points of evidence for the fact that there is some type of embedded systemic racism.
This report scratched the surface of the impacts of systemic racism in America. As so many have said in recent weeks, it's important to educate yourself.